in the stillness of a remote observatory, where the stars seem almost close enough to touch, Dr. Elara Voss sat alone, the weight of her past pressed heavily on her shoulders. A failed deep space mission, a crew lost to the void, and a guilt that never seemed to fade. But tonight, the silence was broken. A faint, almost imperceptible signal reached her instruments, a whisper from the farthest edge of the known universe. It wasn't static or random noise. It was a pattern, a melody woven with fragments of images, a message from a world on the brink of vanishing. As Alara leaned closer to her console, her breath caught. This wasn't just a signal. It was a plea, a cry for help from a civilization desperate to be heard. And in that moment, she knew her life would never be the same. What began as a whisper would soon grow into a roar, pulling her into a mystery that would challenge everything she thought she knew about the cosmos and herself. Elara's fingers trembled as she traced the lines of the strange symbols flickering across her screen. Each curve and angle seemed to pulse with an eerie familiarity, as though they were echoes of something buried deep within her. Memories of her lost crew, fragments of their voices she thought she'd never hear again. She couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't just a random pattern. It was a language, a story waiting to be told, but deciphering it alone felt impossible. She needed someone who could see beyond the obvious, someone who understood the unspoken rhythms of the unknown. That's when she thought of Kael, a name whispered among the scientific community, a linguist who had spent years decoding the indecipherable. Reclusive, brilliant, and notoriously difficult to work with, Kael was a risk, but Alara had no choice. With a deep breath, she reached out, her message brief but urgent. To her surprise, he agreed to meet. Their first encounter was tense. Kael's sharp intellect cut through the room like a blade, his skepticism evident as he eyed the symbols on Alara's screen. "You're chasing ghosts," he said flatly, his voice tinged with doubt. But Alara's desperation was palpable, her conviction unshakable. "This isn't just noise," she insisted, her voice trembling with emotion. "It's a message, and if we don't figure it out, we might lose it forever." Reluctantly, Kale agreed to help. As they worked side by side, the tension between them simmered, his analytical precision clashing with her emotional drive. Yet slowly, the symbols began to reveal their secrets. They formed a pattern, a sequence that hinted at something far greater than either of them had anticipated. It wasn't just a message, it was a warning about an event so vast, so catastrophic, it defied comprehension. The words were fragmented, the meaning unclear, but one thing was certain: time was running out. As they delved deeper, the observatory's systems began to falter. Lights flickered, screens glitched, and the hum of machinery stuttered into silence. At first, they dismissed it as a technical malfunction, but the disturbances grew more frequent, more deliberate. It was as though something, or someone, was watching, interfering, trying to stop them from uncovering the truth. Elara's heart raced as she glanced at Kale, his usual composure cracking under the weight of the unknown. "This isn't just a coincidence," he muttered, his voice low. "Something doesn't want us to see this." The air in the room grew heavier, charged with an unseen energy. The symbols on the screen shifted again, their patterns twisting into something darker, more urgent. Elara's mind raced, her thoughts a whirlwind of fear and determination. She had lost her crew once. She couldn't lose this chance to make their sacrifice mean something. And as the observatory systems groaned under the strain, she realized one terrifying truth. The signal wasn't just a warning, it was a beacon, and whatever was coming, it was closer than they thought. Elara's eyes widened as the symbols on the screen rearranged themselves once more, this time forming a star map. It was unlike anything she'd ever seen, a constellation of unfamiliar stars, with one point glowing brighter than the rest. Her pulse quickened as she realized what it was: coordinates to a distant, uncharted planet, hidden in the farthest reaches of the galaxy. "This is it," she whispered, her voice trembling with a mix of awe and urgency. "This is where the signal is coming from." Kale leaned in, his sharp features illuminated by the flickering light of the screen. His expression was unreadable, but the skepticism in his voice was unmistakable. "You're basing a lot on a few lines of code," he said, his tone cautious. "This could be nothing more than a cosmic coincidence. Chasing shadows like this, it's dangerous, Ellara. You know that." But Ellara wasn't listening. Her mind was already racing ahead, piecing together the fragments of the transmission, the haunting melody, the images that seemed to blur the line between reality and memory. "This isn't a coincidence," she insisted, her voice firm despite the tremor in her hands. "This planet, it's connected to the signal. It's the key to understanding who sent it and why." Kale exhaled sharply, running a hand through his dark hair. "Even if you're right, do you have any idea what it would take to reach it? The resources, the risks?" "This isn't just a scientific expedition. It's a gamble. And if we're wrong, it could cost us everything." Elara turned to face him, her gaze steady. "We've already lost too much to let this go unanswered. If there's even a chance we can uncover the truth, we have to take it." Her words hung in the air, heavy with the weight of her past, her guilt, her unshakable need to make sense of the chaos that had defined her life since the failed mission. Reluctantly, Kale agreed to help her present their findings to the observatory's board. The meeting was tense, the room filled with skeptical faces and probing questions. "You're asking us to fund a mission based on a signal you can't fully decode," one of the board members said, his voice tinged with doubt. "What makes you so sure this isn't just a wild goose chase?" Elara's response was measured but unwavering. "Because I've seen what happens when we ignore the unknown. This signal, it's a message, a warning, and if we don't act now, we might never get another chance." Her conviction was enough to sway them, though the funding came with conditions: a tight timeline, minimal resources, and constant oversight. As the preparations for the expedition began, the tension between Elara's professional duty and her personal obsession grew. Her superiors watched her closely, their skepticism a constant reminder of the risks she was taking. But it wasn't just their doubts that weighed on her, it was the fear of what they might find. The closer they got to launching, the more the signal seemed to echo in her mind, its haunting melody a reminder of the stakes. Kale, too, felt the pressure. His usual composure cracked under the weight of the unknown, his sharp wit giving way to moments of quiet introspection. "We're stepping into the dark, Elara," he said one night, as they review the star map. And I'm not sure what scares me more, or what we might find, or what we might not. Ellara didn't answer. She couldn't. The truth was, she felt the same fear, the same uncertainty. But it was overshadowed by something stronger, the need to know, to understand, to finally make peace with the ghosts that had haunted her for so long. And as the countdown to launch began, she couldn't shake the feeling that this journey would change everything, not just for her, but for all of humanity. The stars had spoken, and she was ready to listen. The expedition launched with a quiet intensity, the ship cutting through the void of space, like a needle threading the fabric of the cosmos. Elara stood at the helm, her gaze fixed on the star map that had become their guiding light. Beside her, Kale monitored the systems with his usual precision, though his sharp eyes betrayed a flicker of unease. The crew, a small, carefully selected team of specialists, worked in silence, each aware of the weight of their mission. They were venturing into uncharted territory, drawn by a signal that had already defied explanation. As the journey progressed, the rhythm of the ship became a strange kind of lullaby, lulling the crew into a fragile sense of routine. But for Elara, sleep brought no rest. Each night, she was pulled into vivid, haunting dreams of the distant world. Shadowy figures moved through landscapes of jagged cliffs and shimmering, alien skies. The melodies from the transmission echoed in her mind, weaving through the dreams like a thread, connecting her to something vast and incomprehensible. She would wake drenched in sweat, the images lingering like fragments of a memory she couldn't quite grasp. At first, she kept the dreams to herself, dismissing them as the product of an overactive imagination. But as they grew more intense, more real, she couldn't ignore them. One morning, over a tense breakfast of synthetic rations, she confessed to Kael. "It's like I'm there," she said, her voice low. "Like I can feel the air, hear the wind, and the figures there trying to tell me something." Kael's expression darkened, his skepticism clashing with the concern in his eyes. "You're exhausted, Elara, pushing yourself like this. It's not healthy. These dreams, they're just your mind trying to make sense of everything." But Elara shook her head, her hands gripping the edge of the table. "No, this is different. It's too vivid, too specific. I think it's the signal. It's reaching out to me somehow." Her words hung in the air, heavy with implications neither of them wanted to fully acknowledge. The crew, already on edge, began to notice the changes in Elara. Her once steady demeanor gave way to moments of distraction, her gaze often distant, as though she were listening to something only she could hear. Whispers of unease spread through the ship, the tension palpable. Kale, ever the pragmatist, tried to keep the team focused, but even he couldn't ignore the growing sense that something was wrong. Then came the malfunctions. At first, they were minor, a flicker of the lights, a brief delay in the navigation system, but soon, the disturbances became more pronounced. The ship's AI, usually reliable, began to glitch, its voice stuttering into silence. Data streams corrupted, and the star map they had relied on shifted unpredictably, as though the coordinates themselves were being rewritten. The crew scrambled to find the cause, but every diagnostic came back inconclusive. Elara's dreams grew darker, more urgent. The shadowy figures became clearer, their movements deliberate, their voices, though still muffled, carrying a tone of warning. The melodies from the transmission now seemed to resonate through the ship itself, a low hum that no one else could hear but Alara. She began to wonder if she was losing her mind, or if the signal was somehow infiltrating her thoughts, her very being. Kale confronted her one evening, his usual composure frayed at the edges. "This is getting out of hand, Alara. The crew is spooked, the systems are failing, and you're not yourself. We need to consider that this mission might be more dangerous than we thought." Ellara met his gaze, her own resolve unwavering despite the shadows under her eyes. "I know it's hard to believe, Kale, but I think the signal is trying to guide us. These dreams, the malfunctions, it's all connected. If we turn back now, we might never know the truth." Kale hesitated, his sharp mind weighing the risks. He wanted to argue, to insist that they prioritize their safety over her instincts. But something in her voice, in her unwavering conviction, gave him pause. For the first time, he allowed himself to consider the possibility that she might be right, that the signal was more than just a message. It was a presence, reaching out across the void, drawing them closer to a truth that could change everything. And as the ship pressed onward, the line between reality and hallucination blurred further, leaving them all to wonder, were they explorers, or were they the ones being explored? The ship descended through the thin, hazy atmosphere of the planet. Its surface, a patchwork of jagged rock formations and sprawling ruins that stretched as far as the eye could see. From above, the structures looked almost organic, their curves and spirals defying the logic of human architecture. As the landing gear touched down, the crew felt a strange vibration beneath their feet, a low, resonant hum that seemed to echo the melodies from the transmission. It was as though the planet itself was alive, its pulse syncing with the signal that had drawn them here. Ellara stepped out first, her boots crunching against the brittle ground. The air was cold and charged with an almost electric energy, sending a shiver down her spine. She glanced back at the crew, their faces a mix of awe and apprehension. Kale followed close behind, his sharp eyes scanning the ruins with a mix of curiosity and caution. "This place is older than anything we've ever seen," he muttered, his voice barely audible over the hum of the wind. The ruins loomed ahead, their surfaces etched with the same symbols that had appeared in the transmission. Ellara felt a strange pull, as though the structures were calling to her. She led the team forward, her steps steady despite the unease gnawing at her. The closer they got, the louder the hum became, the melodies weaving through the air like invisible threads. It was both beautiful and unsettling, a symphony of something ancient and unknowable. At the center of the ruins, they found it, a massive, crystalline structure pulsating with a faint, bluish light. Its surface was covered in the same symbols, now glowing softly as though reacting to their presence. Elara's breath caught in her throat. "This is it," she whispered, her voice trembling with a mix of excitement and dread. The source of the signal, Kale stepped forward, his analytical mind already racing. "This technology, it's beyond anything we've ever encountered, but we don't know what it's capable of. Activating it could be dangerous. It could be a trap." Ellara turned to him, her eyes blazing with determination. "We didn't come all this way to turn back now. This is why we're here, to find answers, to understand. The crew exchanged uneasy glances, the weight of the moment pressing down on them. Kale hesitated, his usual confidence wavering. Ellara, think about this. We don't know what we're dealing with. If we activate this, there's no telling what could happen. But Ellara was already moving, her hands brushing against the crystalline surface. The symbols flared to life, their light intensifying as the hum grew louder, more urgent. She could feel the structure responding to her touch, as though it recognized her on some primal level. The crew watched in stunned silence as the ground beneath them began to tremble, the ruins coming alive with a power they couldn't comprehend. Kale reached out, his voice urgent. Elara, stop. You don't know what you're, but it was too late. With a final surge of light, the structure activated, its energy rippling outward like a shockwave. The air crackled with electricity, and the melodies from the transmission swelled into a deafening crescendo. The crew stumbled back, shielding their eyes as the ruins began to shift, their shapes twisting and reconfiguring as though awakening from a long slumber. Elara stood at the center of it all, her heart pounding as she realized what they had done. They hadn't just activated ancient technology, they had awakened something. Something that had been waiting, dormant for millennia. And as the light began to fade, the crew found themselves face to face with a truth far greater and far more terrifying than they had ever imagined. The planet had spoken, and now it was listening. The crystalline structure pulsed with an otherworldly glow as the holographic recordings flickered to life around them. Figures of the planet's ancient inhabitants materialized, their forms shimmering like ghosts caught between worlds. Their voices, though distorted by time, carried a weight of urgency that sent a chill through the crew. The holograms spoke of a civilization that had thrived for millennia, only to be brought to its knees by a cosmic force so vast and destructive, it defied comprehension. Elara's heart raced as she listened, her eyes darting between the figures. The recordings described a cataclysm, a wave of annihilation that had swept across their world, leaving nothing but ruins in its wake. The entity responsible was unlike anything humanity had ever encountered, a being of pure energy, consuming entire star systems as it moved through the cosmos. The inhabitants had called it the Devourer, a name that resonated with a primal, instinctive fear. Kale stepped closer, his sharp features illuminated by the flickering light. This can't be real, he murmured, his voice barely above a whisper, but the evidence was undeniable. The holograms continued, their final message clear. The signal had been their last hope, a desperate plea for help from a civilization on the brink of extinction. Elara's mind reeled as the implications sank in. If the recordings were accurate, the Devourer wasn't just a relic of the past. It was still out there, moving relentlessly through the galaxy. And worse, it was heading toward Earth. The realization hit her like a tidal wave, her breath catching in her throat. "We need to warn them," she said, her voice trembling with urgency. "If this thing is still active, we don't have much time." The crew erupted into a flurry of debate, their voices overlapping in a cacophony of fear and uncertainty. Some argued for an immediate retreat, insisting that their priority should be to return to Earth and prepare for the impending threat. Others, like Kale, hesitated, his analytical mind weighing the risks of staying longer. If we leave now, we might never get another chance to understand this, he said, his tone measured but conflicted. We need more information, something concrete to take back. Elara stepped forward, her gaze steady despite the turmoil swirling inside her. I know the risks, she said, her voice firm, but if we leave now, we'll be flying blind. We don't know how to fight this thing, or even if it can be fought. These recordings, they're our only chance to learn more. Her words hung in the air, heavy with the weight of her conviction. The crew fell silent, the gravity of the situation pressing down on them. The ruins around them seemed to hum with a quiet intensity, as though the planet itself was urging them to stay, to uncover the truth hidden within its ancient walls. Kale exhaled sharply, his usual skepticism giving way to reluctant agreement. All right, he said finally, but we do this carefully. No unnecessary risks. As the crew began to gather more data, Alara couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. The holograms flickered intermittently, their fragmented messages hinting at something deeper, something darker. The melodies from the transmission echoed faintly in the background, a haunting reminder of the connection between the planet and the Devourer. Hours passed as they worked, the tension in the air growing thicker with each passing moment. Then, as if in response to their efforts, the ruins shifted once more. New holograms appeared, their images clearer, their voices more urgent. They spoke of a weapon, a device capable of repelling the Devourer, hidden somewhere within the ruins. But the recordings were incomplete, their instructions fragmented and cryptic. Elara's pulse quickened as she turned to Kael. We need to find it, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. If this weapon exists, it could be our only hope. Kael nodded, his expression grim. But if we're wrong, we could be wasting precious time. Time we might not have. The crew exchanged uneasy glances, the weight of their decision pressing down on them. The ruins, once silent and lifeless, now seemed to pulse with a quiet energy, as though the planet itself was urging them forward. Elara took a deep breath, her resolve hardening. We can't afford to ignore this, she said. We stay, we find the weapon, and we make sure Earth has a fighting chance. As the crew prepared to delve deeper into the ruins, the air around them seemed to hum with anticipation. The Devourer was out there, moving inexorably closer, and time was running out. But for now, they had a mission, one that could mean the difference between survival and annihilation. The planet had spoken, and its secrets were waiting to be uncovered. The deeper they ventured into the ruins, the more the planet seemed to resist their presence. Strange phenomena began to unfold, defying the laws of physics as they knew them. Time itself felt unstable, moments stretched unnaturally, leaving the crew disoriented and uneasy. One moment, they'd be walking through a narrow passage, and the next, they'd find themselves retracing steps they swore they hadn't taken. Gravity shifted unpredictably, pulling them in directions that made no sense, as though the planet were alive and testing their limits. And then there were the whispers. Faint, almost imperceptible at first, they grew louder the further they went, echoing through the ruins like voices from another dimension. Elara was the first to notice them. At first, she thought it was just the wind, but the whispers carried a rhythm, a cadence that mirrored the haunting melodies from the transmission. She couldn't shake the feeling that they were trying to communicate, to guide her. Her obsession deepened, her focus narrowing to the point where she barely noticed the growing tension among the crew. Every step she took was driven by a singular purpose: to understand the entity, to uncover its secrets before it was too late. Kale, on the other hand, was growing increasingly wary. The anomalies, the whispers, the way Ellara seemed to be slipping further into her own world. It all felt like a warning. "This isn't just science anymore," he said during one of their brief pauses, his voice low but urgent. "We're dealing with something we can't control. And if we're not careful, it's going to consume us." The crew began to fracture, the strain of their mission pulling them in opposite directions. Some sided with Ellara, drawn to her unwavering determination and the possibility of uncovering something extraordinary. Others aligned with Kale, his caution and skepticism offering a sense of stability in the face of the unknown. Arguments broke out more frequently, the once cohesive team now divided by fear and doubt. And then the shadows appeared. At first, they were fleeting dark shapes, moving at the edges of their vision, disappearing the moment they turned to look. But soon, the figures became more substantial, their forms vaguely humanoid but twisted, as though born from the void itself. They didn't attack, didn't speak, but their presence was undeniable, a constant reminder that they were not alone. Ellara saw them as a sign, a manifestation of the entity's presence. "They're trying to communicate," she insisted, her voice tinged with a mix of excitement and desperation. "We need to understand what they're saying." Kale, however, saw only danger. "These aren't messengers, Ellara. They're warnings. We're in over our heads, and if we don't pull back now, we're going to lose everything." His words were met with silence, the crew torn between their trust in him and their desire to follow Elara's lead. As the days passed, the phenomena grew more intense. Time distortions became more frequent, leaving the crew struggling to keep track of how long they'd been in the ruins. Gravity shifts sent equipment tumbling, and the whispers grew louder, more insistent, as though the planet itself was urging them to leave. But Ellara pressed on, her determination unshaken. She began to spend hours alone, studying the holograms and the crystalline structure, convinced that the answers they sought were just within reach. Kael, meanwhile, grew more distrustful of her judgment. "You're not thinking clearly," he said one evening, his voice edged with frustration. "This obsession, it's clouding your judgment. We need to regroup, reassess, before it's too late." But Ellara barely heard him. Her mind was elsewhere, consumed by the whispers, the shadows, the endless echoes of the transmission. She was close. She could feel it. The entity was trying to show her something, to guide her to the weapon that could save them all. And as the crew's division deepened, the shadows grew bolder, their movements more deliberate, as though they were waiting for the moment when the team's fragile unity would finally break. The ruins, once silent and lifeless, now pulsed with an eerie energy, a reminder that they were no longer just explorers. They were intruders in a place that did not want them, caught in a web of forces they could not begin to understand. And as the entity's presence grew stronger, the line between ally and adversary blurred, leaving them all to wonder, were they chasing answers, or were they the ones being hunted? Elara's footsteps echoed through the narrow, winding passage, as she followed the whispers deeper into the heart of the ruins. The air grew colder, the walls around her shimmering faintly with the same bluish light that had guided them since their arrival. The whispers, once faint and fragmented, now seemed to coalesce into a single, insistent voice, a voice that pulled her forward, towards something she couldn't yet see, but felt with every fiber of her being. When she finally emerged into the chamber, her breath caught. The room was vast, its walls lined with intricate carvings that pulsed with the same alien symbols they'd seen before. But at its center stood something entirely new, a towering, crystalline device, unlike anything she'd ever encountered. It hummed softly, its surface rippling with energy, as though alive and waiting. Elara's heart raced as she approached, her mind racing with possibilities. "This is it," she murmured, her voice trembling with awe. "This is what they were trying to show us." Kale entered the chamber moments later, his sharp eyes scanning the structure with a mix of curiosity and apprehension. "What is this?" he asked, his tone cautious. "Some kind of transmitter," Elara nodded, her fingers brushing against the device's surface. "I think it's more than that. It's a counter signal, a way to communicate with the entity. Maybe even stop it." Her voice was filled with a desperate hope, her guilt over her past failures driving her to seize this chance, no matter the cost. But Kael's skepticism was immediate. "We don't know what this thing does, Elara. Activating it could destabilize the entire planet, or worse, draw the entity's attention directly to us. We're not ready for that." His words were measured, but the urgency in his voice was unmistakable. Elara turned to face him, her eyes blazing with resolve. "We don't have the luxury of waiting. If this device can help us, we have to try. We can't keep running from what we don't understand." The tension between them crackled like static, their opposing views reflecting the fracture that had been growing within the crew. Kael's pragmatism clashed with Elara's recklessness, his fear of the unknown warring with her need to act. "You're letting your guilt cloud your judgment," he said finally, his voice low. "This isn't just about you, Elara. It's about all of us." Her hands clenched at her sides, her jaw tightening as she fought back the emotions threatening to overwhelm her. "I know what's at stake, but if we don't take this risk, we might as well give up now. I won't let fear stop me, not again." Without waiting for his response, she turned back to the device, her fingers tracing the symbols that seemed to glow brighter at her touch. The hum grew louder, the air around them vibrating with a palpable energy. Kael reached out to stop her, but it was too late. With a final, decisive motion, Elara activated the device. The chamber erupted in light, the hum swelling into a deafening roar that shook the very ground beneath their feet. The counter signal surged outward, a wave of energy that seemed to ripple through the fabric of reality itself. For a moment, everything was still, and then the planet began to tremble, the ruins around them groaning under the strain. Kael grabbed Elara's arm, his voice urgent. "What have you done? This isn't just destabilizing the planet. It's sending a beacon straight to the entity." Elara's heart pounded as she realized the truth. The counter signal hadn't just attracted the entity's attention, it had awakened it. The ground beneath them cracked, the air filled with a low, ominous rumble that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. The shadows that had haunted them since their arrival now twisted into sharp, jagged shapes, their forms more defined, more menacing. The crew scrambled to regroup, their voices rising in panic as the planet's instability grew more pronounced. Ellara stood frozen, her guilt and determination colliding in a storm of emotions. She had gambled everything on this moment, and now the stakes were higher than ever. The entity was coming, and with it, the possibility of answers or annihilation. As the ruins began to collapse around them, the counter-signal continued to pulse, its light cutting through the chaos like a beacon in the dark. Elara's mind raced, her resolve hardening even as fear clawed at the edges of her consciousness. They had crossed a line, and there was no turning back. The entity was no longer a distant threat. It was here, and it was watching. The question now was whether they could survive long enough to confront it. The ground beneath the crew's feet trembled violently, the once stable ruins cracking and splintering as the planet's core began to destabilize. Dust and debris rained down from above, the air thick with the acrid scent of burning stone. The crew scrambled to gather their equipment, shouting over the deafening roar of the collapsing ruins. "We need to go. Now," one of the team members yelled, their voice barely audible over the chaos. But Elara stood firm, her eyes locked on the crystalline device as it pulsed with an otherworldly light. The whispers had grown louder, more insistent, and she was certain they were on the verge of a breakthrough. "Not yet," she said, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. "We're so close. We can't leave without answers." Kale grabbed her arm, his grip firm but not unkind. "Elara, this isn't just about you," he said, his voice sharp with urgency. "You're risking all of us for a chance at redemption. Is that really worth it?" Her gaze flickered to his, a storm of guilt and determination swirling in her eyes. "This isn't about redemption," she shot back, her voice rising above the din. "It's about survival. If we don't understand this thing, we're all as good as dead anyway." Before Kale could respond, the device surged again, its light intensifying to a blinding radiance. The air around them seemed to warp, the ground trembling with a force that knocked them off their feet. And then, as suddenly as it began, everything went still. The light coalesced into a massive, swirling projection, a vision of the entity itself. It was unlike anything they had ever imagined. Vast and incomprehensible, it moved through the void like a storm, its form shifting and writhing with an energy that defied description. Stars flickered and died in its wake, entire systems consumed as it passed. But as the crew watched transfixed, the vision shifted again, revealing something unexpected. The entity wasn't malevolent. It wasn't driven by malice or intent. It was a force of nature, as natural and inevitable as a supernova or a black hole. Destruction wasn't its purpose, it was simply its nature. Elara's breath caught in her throat as the realization hit her. "It's not evil," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "It's just inevitable." Kael stared at the projection, his usual skepticism giving way to a reluctant understanding. "If that's true, then we can't stop it," he said, his tone grim. "We can only try to survive it." The vision faded, leaving the chamber in silence. The crew stood frozen, the weight of what they'd seen pressing down on them. The entity wasn't an enemy to be defeated. It was a force to be understood, a phenomenon as old as the universe itself. and as the ruins around them began to collapse once more, the urgency of their mission shifted. They weren't fighting against the entity anymore. They were racing to learn from it, to find a way to coexist with something that defied comprehension. Ellara turned to Kale, her expression a mix of awe and resolve. "We need to get this information back to Earth," she said, her voice steady. "If we can't stop it, we have to find a way to live with it." Kale nodded, his usual sharp edges softened by the gravity of the moment. "Then let's move, before this planet takes us with it." The crew sprang into action, their earlier divisions momentarily forgotten as they worked together to evacuate the ruins. The path back to their ship was fraught with danger, the ground crumbling beneath them and the air thick with debris. But as they ran, the vision of the entity lingered in their minds, a reminder of the enormity of what they were facing. It wasn't just a threat, it was a revelation, a glimpse into the vast, indifferent forces that shaped the cosmos. And as the ship lifted off, leaving the crumbling planet behind, Alara couldn't shake the feeling that their journey was far from over. The entity was out there, moving inexorably through the stars, and humanity's only hope lay in understanding it. The question now was whether they could learn enough to survive, or if they were simply delaying the inevitable. As the ship ascended, leaving the crumbling planet behind, Ellara stared at the date, as streaming across the console. The fragments of the holographic recordings, the whispers, the haunting melodies, all of it began to coalesce into a single, undeniable truth. The entity wasn't a destroyer, it was a catalyst, a force designed to reset worlds on the brink of collapse, clearing the way for new life to emerge from the ashes of the old. Her breath hitched as the weight of the revelation settled over her. "It's not here to destroy us," she said, her voice quiet but firm. "It's here to renew." Kale, seated beside her, glanced up from his own console, his sharp features etched with skepticism. "Renew," he echoed, his tone cautious. "You're saying this thing is some kind of cosmic gardener?" Ellara nodded, her gaze distant as she pieced together the implications. "Think about it. What we saw on that planet, the civilization that sent the signal, they weren't just warning us about the entity. They were trying to explain it. It's not malevolent, it's necessary. When a world can no longer sustain life, the entity resets it. It's part of a cycle, one we've never understood until now." The crew fell silent, the enormity of her words sinking in. If she was right, the entity wasn't something to be fought or feared. It was something to be prepared for. Humanity's survival depended on understanding its role in the universe, not resisting it. "We need to send a transmission," Ellara said, her voice gaining urgency. "Earth has to know what's coming. They need to prepare, not just for survival, but for adaptation." Kale exhaled sharply, running a hand through his dark hair. "You're asking a lot, Ellara. Even if we send a message, there's no guarantee they'll believe us. And even if they do, how do you prepare for something like this?" "We don't have a choice," she replied, her tone resolute. "If we don't try, we're condemning them to face this blind. We owe them the truth." Reluctantly, Kale agreed, his usual pragmatism giving way to the gravity of the situation. Together, they began drafting the transmission, their words a blend of scientific data and raw, unfiltered urgency. The message was clear. The entity was not an enemy, but a force of nature. Humanity's only hope lay in adaptation, in finding a way to coexist with the inevitable. But as they worked, the planet below began to collapse in earnest. The ground split apart, rivers of molten rock surging to the surface as the ruins they just escaped crumbled into the abyss. The ship's sensors blared warnings, the instability of the planet threatening to pull them back into the chaos. "We need to move," one of the crew members shouted, their voice strained with panic. "If we don't get out of here now, we're not going to make it." Elara hesitated, her hands hovering over the console. The transmission wasn't complete, they needed more time. But time was a luxury they no longer had. "Send it as it is," she said, her voice tight with urgency. "It's not perfect, but it's enough. Earth needs to know." Kale nodded, his fingers flying across the controls as he initiated the transmission. The ship shuddered as the ground beneath them heaved, the planet's final moments playing out in a cacophony of destruction. "We're losing stability," he warned, his tone clipped. "If we don't leave now, we're not going to make it." Elara's heart pounded as the ship's engines roared to life, straining against the planet's gravitational pull. The transmission had been sent, but the cost was becoming painfully clear. The entity's presence loomed larger than ever, its energy distorting the very fabric of reality around them. The crew's perceptions began to warp, time and space, bending in ways that defied explanation. Shadows flickered at the edges of their vision, whispers echoed in their minds, and the line between reality and hallucination blurred. As the ship struggled to break free, Elara felt a strange sense of calm amidst the chaos. They had done what they could. The message was out there, a beacon of hope in the face of the unknown. But the entity's presence was growing overwhelming, its energy pressing down on them like a weight. The crew's resolve was tested, their unity fraying under the strain of the distortions. "Stay focused," Kale barked, his voice cutting through the tension. "We're almost clear, just hold on." The ship lurched violently, alarms blaring as it fought to escape the planet's grip. Elara gripped the console, her knuckles white as she stared out at the collapsing world. The entity was there, its presence undeniable, its purpose now clear. It wasn't just a force of destruction, it was a harbinger of renewal, and as the ship finally broke free, hurtling into the safety of space, Elara couldn't shake the feeling that their journey was far from over. The entity was coming, and humanity's fate hung in the balance. But for now, they had bought themselves time to prepare, to adapt, and to face the inevitable with eyes wide open. The stars stretched out before them, vast and indifferent, and somewhere in the void, the entity moved ever closer, a reminder that in the grand tapestry of the cosmos, even the end was just the beginning. The ship's alarms blared, their sharp tones cutting through the chaos as the crew raced toward the safety of their vessel. The ground beneath them buckled and split, molten rock surging through the cracks, while the air itself seemed to warp and distort under the entity's influence. Elara led the way, her steps steady despite the tremors shaking the planet apart. But as they ran, something shifted. The world around her blurred, the ruins and the chaos fading into a hazy, dreamlike haze. Suddenly, she was no longer on the crumbling planet. She stood in a vast, empty space, the stars stretching endlessly in every direction. And there, in front of her, were the faces she thought she'd never see again, her lost crew. They stood together, their expressions calm but firm, their presence a bittersweet balm to her aching guilt. "Elara," one of them said, their voice gentle but insistent. "You have to let go. We're gone, but you're still here. You can't keep carrying this weight. It's going to destroy you." Her breath hitched, tears welling in her eyes. "I failed you," she whispered, her voice breaking. "I couldn't save you." The figure stepped closer, their gaze unwavering. "You didn't fail us. You're still trying to save everyone else." "That's what matters now. Let us go, Ellara. Focus on the living. They need you." The vision began to fade, the stars dimming as the ruins rushed back into view. Elara stumbled, the weight of her guilt lifting just enough to allow a flicker of clarity. She had a mission, a purpose, and for the first time in years, she felt the stirrings of hope. But the entity's influence was far from over. As the crew pressed on, the hallucinations began to spread, twisting their perceptions and sowing doubt. Kale, usually so composed, found himself struggling to trust what he saw. The ruins around them seemed to shift and morph, their shapes taking on menacing forms. Shadows moved at the edges of his vision, whispering things he couldn't quite hear. And then there was Elara. To Kael, she seemed different, driven, yes, but also reckless, her determination teetering on the edge of obsession. He couldn't shake the feeling that she was leading them into danger, her focus on the entity, blinding her to the risks. "Elara," he called out, his voice tight with frustration. "We need to stop. We can't keep pushing like this. It's too dangerous." She turned to him, her eyes blazing with a fire he didn't recognize. "We don't have a choice, Kael. If we stop now, we lose everything." The tension between them crackled, their opposing views reflecting the fractures spreading through the crew. Some sided with Elara, drawn to her unyielding resolve. Others aligned with Kael, his caution, a lifeline in the face of the unknown. The hallucinations grew more vivid, more personal, each member of the crew confronted by their own fears and regrets. For Elara, the visions were a mix of clarity and chaos. The faces of her lost crew appeared again, their words a reminder to stay focused. But the entity's influence was relentless, distorting their messages into whispers of doubt. "You're not strong enough," a voice hissed in her ear. "You'll fail them too." She shook her head, forcing herself to push forward. The ship was close now, its silhouette visible through the haze of dust and smoke. But the journey had taken its toll. The crew was exhausted, their unity frayed, their trust in each other hanging by a thread. Kael's distrust of Elara deepened, his pragmatism clashing with her relentless drive. As they reached the ship, the ground beneath them gave way, a chasm opening up just steps from the ramp. The crew scrambled aboard, the ship's engines roaring to life as the planet began to collapse in earnest. But the entity's influence followed them, its energy seeping into the ship's systems, its whispers echoing in their minds. Elara stood at the helm, her hands steady as she guided the ship away from the crumbling world. The vision of her crew lingered in her mind, their words a beacon of clarity in the storm. She had a choice to make, hold on to the past, or fight for the future. And as the ship hurtled into the safety of space, she knew what she had to do. The entity was coming, and humanity's survival depended on their ability to face it together. But first, They had to find a way to trust each other again. The ship's engines roared as the crew scrambled aboard, the ground beneath them disintegrating into chaos. Molten rock surged through the cracks, the planet's surface heaving and splintering as the entity's gravitational pull intensified. The ship trembled violently, its systems straining against the colossal force, threatening to drag them back into the abyss. Alarms blared, their shrill tones a constant reminder of the dwindling window for escape. Elara's mind raced as she assessed their options, her hands flying across the console. "We can't break free with the engines alone," she said, her voice cutting through the noise. "The entity's pull is too strong." Kale, standing beside her, clenched his jaw as he scanned the data. "Then what's the plan? We can't just sit here and wait for it to crush us." His tone was sharp, the tension between them palpable, but there was no time for debate. Elara turned to him, her expression a mix of determination and urgency. "We use the planet's collapsing core. If we time it right, we can slingshot off its gravitational field and break free. But it's going to be tight. We'll have to hit the exact moment the core destabilizes. 1 second too early or too late, and we're done." The crew exchanged uneasy glances, the weight of her words sinking in. Kael's skepticism was obvious, his sharp eyes narrowing as he processed the risk. "You're talking about threading a needle in the middle of a hurricane. One wrong move, and we're not just dead, we're obliterated." Elara nodded, her resolve unwavering. "It's the only way, but to make it work, someone needs to stay behind and manually trigger the slingshot mechanism. It has to be precise, and it has to be timed perfectly." A heavy silence fell over the crew as her implication became clear. She was volunteering to stay behind. Kael's expression hardened, his usual pragmatism giving way to something sharper. "You're not serious. You think you can just, sacrifice yourself and call it a day?" "That's not a plan, Elara. That's a suicide mission." Her gaze met his steady and unflinching. "It's the only way to ensure the rest of you make it out alive. If I stay, I can trigger the mechanism and buy you enough time to escape. If I don't, none of us are getting out of here." The crew erupted into protests, their voices overlapping in a cacophony of fear and disbelief. But Elara held up a hand, her tone firm. "There's no time to argue. Kale, you're the best pilot we have. You need to take the controls. The rest of you, strap in and prepare for the most turbulent ride of your lives." Kale stared at her, his usual composure cracking under the weight of her decision. For a moment, it seemed like he might refuse, like he might find another way. But the ship shuddered violently, the entity's pull growing stronger by the second. Finally, he nodded, his voice tight. "Fine, but if this doesn't work, I'm never letting you live it down." Elara managed a faint smile, her hands already moving to gather the tools she'd need. "I'll hold you to that." As the crew prepared for the maneuver, Elara made her way to the ship's lower deck, where the manual override for the slingshot mechanism was located. The corridors were dark, the ship's systems flickering under the strain. She could feel the entity's presence pressing in, its energy distorting the air around her. But she pushed forward, her focus razor sharp. When she reached the mechanism, she hesitated for just a moment, her hand hovering over the controls. The faces of her lost crew flashed in her mind, their voices a quiet echo of the past. Let us go, they seemed to say. Focus on the living. With a deep breath, she activated the system, her fingers moving with practiced precision. The ship's engines roared to life, the vibrations reverberating through the deck as Kale took the controls. Ready on your mark. His voice crackled over the comms, his usual sharpness softened by something she couldn't quite place. Elara's eyes flicked to the timer, her heart pounding as the seconds ticked down. The planet's core was on the brink of collapse, its energy building to a critical point. 3, 2, 1 now, she shouted, her voice steady despite the chaos. The ship lurched violently, its trajectory shifting as the slingshot mechanism engaged. The force of the maneuver pressed her against the wall, the world around her a blur of light and noise. For a moment, it seemed like it might work, like they might actually make it. But then the alarms blared again, their tones sharper, more urgent. The entity's pull was stronger than they'd anticipated, its energy distorting the very fabric of space around them. Elara's grip tightened on the console, her mind racing. They were so close they couldn't fail now. Kale, she called into the comms, her voice strained. You need to push the engines to their limit. If we don't break free now, we're not going to make it. There was a pause, and then his voice came through, steady and resolute. Understood. Hold on, Elara. We're not losing you. The ship surged forward, its engines screaming as Kael pushed them to the brink. The entity's pull faltered for a split second, its energy disrupted by the collapsing core. And in that moment, the ship broke free, hurtling into the safety of space. Elara slumped against the console, her breath coming in ragged gasps. They'd made it barely. But as the ship stabilized and the alarms fell silent, she couldn't shake the feeling that their journey was far from over. The entity was still out there, its presence a looming shadow over humanity's future. And as the crew regrouped, their unity tested but unbroken, Elara knew one thing for certain. They were running out of time. As the crew scrambled to secure the ship for the slingshot maneuver, Elara found herself standing alone in the dimly lit lower deck. The hum of the engines vibrated through the metal floor, a steady reminder of the seconds slipping away. Her fingers hovered over the manual override panel, her mind racing not with fear, but with clarity. For the first time in years, the weight of her guilt felt lighter, the faces of her lost crew no longer haunting her but guiding her. She had spent so long running, from her failures, from her past, from the truth. Now, standing on the brink of the unknown, she felt a strange sense of peace. She activated the ship's communication system, her hands steady as she typed out a final message to Earth. The words came easily, as though they had been waiting for this moment. To whoever receives this, she began, her voice calm but urgent. We've learned the truth about the entity. It's not a destroyer, it's a force of renewal, a natural part of the cosmos we've never understood. Humanity must prepare, not to fight it, but to adapt. Our survival depends on embracing change, on finding a way to coexist with the inevitable. This isn't the end. It's a new beginning, but we have to be ready. The message sent, she closed the channel and turned her attention to the slingshot mechanism. The planet's core was on the verge of collapse, its energy building to a critical point. She could feel the vibrations through the deck, a low, ominous rumble that seemed to echo the entity's presence. Her Her hands moved with precision, recalibrating the system to ensure the ship's escape. Every second counted. Every adjustment had to be perfect. Kael's voice crackled over the comms, his usual sharpness softened by something she couldn't quite place. "Ellara, we're ready on your mark. Just say the word." She took a deep breath, her eyes fixed on the timer. 3, 2, 1 now. The ship lurched violently as the slingshot mechanism engaged, its engines roaring as it hurtled toward safety. Elara braced herself against the console, the force of the maneuver pressing her against the wall. She could hear the crew's voices over the comms, their relief palpable as the ship broke free from the planet's gravitational pull. But as the vibrations subsided and the alarms fell silent, she realized with a quiet certainty that she wasn't leaving with them. The entity's presence enveloped her, its energy filling the lower deck like a living thing. The air shimmered with an otherworldly light, the whispers she had heard for so long now coalescing into a single, resonant voice. It wasn't hostile. It wasn't angry. It was curious. She felt its awareness brush against her mind, a sensation that was neither invasive nor frightening, but deeply, profoundly intimate. In that moment, she understood. The entity wasn't a monster. It was a force as old as the stars, a part of the universe's endless cycle of creation and destruction. It didn't destroy out of malice. It renewed out of necessity, and as its energy surrounded her, she felt a strange sense of acceptance, of belonging. She had spent her life searching for meaning, for redemption. Now she had found it. The ship's engines faded into the distance, the crew's voices growing faint as the entity's presence grew stronger. Elara closed her eyes, her breathing steady as she surrendered to the inevitable. She wasn't afraid. She had done what she could. The message was sent. The truth was out there. Humanity had a chance, and that was enough. As the planet's core finally collapsed, the entity's energy surged, its light consuming everything in its path. For a brief, infinite moment, Elara felt herself dissolve, her consciousness merging with the vast, incomprehensible force that had shaped the cosmos since the dawn of time. And in that final, fleeting instant, she understood what it meant to be part of something greater, to be part of the universe itself. The ship hurtled into the safety of space, its crew shaken but alive. Behind them, the planet crumbled into nothingness, its light fading into the void. But somewhere, in the vast expanse of the cosmos, the entity continued its journey, its purpose as eternal as the stars. And though Elara was gone, her message echoed across the void, a beacon of hope in the face of the unknown. Humanity's journey was far from over. The entity was coming, and the future was theirs to shape. The ship emerged from the void, its battered hull a testament to the trials they had endured. Earth loomed ahead, a fragile blue oasis against the endless black. Inside, the crew sat in silence, the weight of their mission pressing heavily on their shoulders. In their hands, they carried not just data and recordings, but the final words of Elara, a message that would change the course of humanity's future. Kale stood by the viewport, his reflection staring back at him, hollow and haunted. His usual sharpness had dulled, replaced by a quiet, simmering guilt. He replayed the moment they left her behind, the split-second decision that had saved them but cost her everything. She made the call, he muttered to himself, though the words offered little comfort. It was her choice, but the image of Ellara, standing alone in the lower deck as the planet crumbled around her, refused to leave him. She had always been the one driven by purpose, by the need to make things right. Now it was his turn to carry that burden. The rest of the crew moved with a subdued energy, their conversations hushed and fragmented. The knowledge of the entity's existence had shifted something in all of them. They had seen the unimaginable, felt the raw, indifferent power of a force that defied comprehension, and now they had to share that truth with a world unprepared to hear it. "How do you explain something like that?" one of them asked, their voice tinged with unease. "How do you tell people their future depends on accepting something they can't even see?" When the ship finally touched down, the world was waiting. News of their return had spread like wildfire, and the transmission from Elara became the focal point of global attention. Her words, calm, resolute, and unflinching, echoed across every screen, every speaker, every corner of the planet. The entity was not an enemy, she had said. It was a force of nature, inevitable and unstoppable. Humanity's survival depended not on resistance, but on adaptation. The reaction was immediate and polarized. Scientists, politicians, and everyday citizens erupted into heated debates, their voices clashing in a cacophony of fear, anger, and hope. Some called for defiance, for the mobilization of every resource to fight the entity head-on. "We can't just roll over and accept this," one prominent figure argued, their voice rising in a rallying cry. "If we go down swinging." Others, however, saw the wisdom in Elara's words. "She's right," a leading astrophysicist said during a televised panel. "This isn't about surrender, it's about survival. We need to rethink what it means to coexist with forces beyond our control." Caught in the middle of it all was Kale. Reluctant and raw, he found himself thrust into the spotlight, the reluctant spokesperson for a message he was still struggling to accept. Reporters bombarded him with questions, their cameras capturing every flicker of emotion on his face. "What was she like?" they asked. "Do you really believe we can survive this?" He answered as best he could, his words measured but heavy with the weight of his experience. Elara believed in the truth, he said during one interview, his voice steady despite the storm brewing inside him. She believed in facing the unknown, no matter how terrifying it might be. If we're going to survive, we need to do the same. But the interviews, the speeches, the endless debates, they couldn't quiet the voice in his head, the one that whispered he had failed her. He had left her behind, and no amount of justification could erase that. At night, he would sit alone, replaying the moments leading up to their escape, wondering if there had been another way. Meanwhile, the world grappled with its own reckoning. The transmission had sparked a seismic shift in how humanity viewed itself, its place in the universe, and its future. For some, it was a call to arms. For others, it was a plea for unity, for the courage to face the unknown together. And as the debates raged on, one thing became clear. The entity was coming, and humanity's time to prepare was running out. Kael knew this better than anyone. He had seen the entity's power firsthand, felt its presence in a way that still sent shivers down his spine. And though he carried the weight of Elara's sacrifice, he also carried her hope, a hope that humanity could rise to the challenge, that they could find a way to survive, even in the face of the inevitable. As he stood before another crowd, another camera, he took a deep breath. The road ahead was uncertain, fraught with challenges and choices that would define their future. But one thing was certain, they couldn't face it alone. Together, they would find a way, or they would fall trying. Years slipped by, and humanity rallied in ways it never had before. The looming threat of the entity forced nations to set aside old rivalries, pooling resources and intellect to develop technologies that might allow them to survive its passage. Cities were fortified, populations relocated, and entire ecosystems re-engineered to withstand the unimaginable. Yet, for all the progress, there was an undercurrent of uncertainty, a question no one dared ask aloud. Would it be enough? Kale, now a prominent figure in the global effort, found himself at the heart of the storm. He had become the reluctant keeper of Elara's legacy, her final message echoing in every decision he made. Her words, calm, resolute, and unflinching, guided humanity's preparations, but they also haunted him. He had left her behind, and no amount of justification could quiet the guilt that gnawed at him. Then the visions began. At first, they were fleeting flickers of light in the corner of his eye, whispers he couldn't quite place. But as time went on, they grew more vivid, more insistent. Elara appeared to him, her presence as real as the air he breathed. She wasn't angry or accusatory. Instead, she seemed serene. "You're doing what you must," she said in one vision, her voice steady and calm. But there's more to this than survival. You need to understand. Kale dismissed the visions as stress-induced hallucinations, the product of a mind stretched too thin. But they persisted, growing clearer with each passing week. In one, he found himself standing on the surface of a distant world, the entity looming overhead like a storm of light and shadow. Elara stood beside him, her hand resting on his shoulder. "This isn't the end," she said. "It's a transformation. I'm still here, Kale. I'm part of it now." Her words lingered long after the vision faded, leaving him with more questions than answers. Was she truly communicating from within the entity? Had her consciousness somehow merged with it? The idea seemed impossible, yet the clarity of her presence defied explanation. As the visions grew more frequent, Kale found himself torn between skepticism and hope. He couldn't ignore the possibility that Elara's consciousness had survived, that she had become something more, a bridge between humanity and the entity. But sharing this with the world was a risk he wasn't ready to take. The global effort was fragile, held together by a delicate balance of fear and determination. Introducing the idea that the entity might not be entirely hostile, that it might even contain the remnants of a human consciousness, could shatter that balance. Still, the visions compelled him to dig deeper. He began to revisit the data from their mission, searching for clues he might have missed. The transmission, the holograms, the whispers, they all pointed to something far more complex than they had initially understood. The entity wasn't just a force of destruction. It was a catalyst, a mechanism for renewal, and if Elara's consciousness had indeed merged with it, perhaps she was guiding them toward a deeper understanding. The thought was both exhilarating and terrifying. It suggested a level of connection between humanity and the entity that no one had dared to consider. But it also raised unsettling questions. If Elara was part of the entity, What did that mean for the rest of them? Could they, too, become part of it? And was that a fate to be feared or embraced? For now, Kale kept these questions to himself, sharing them only with a trusted few. The world wasn't ready for such revelations, and neither was he. But as the entity's arrival drew nearer, he couldn't shake the feeling that Elara's visions were more than just a message. They were a call to action, a reminder that survival wasn't just about enduring the storm. It was about learning to dance in the rain, and so he pressed on, driven by a purpose that was no longer his alone. The road ahead was uncertain, fraught with challenges that would test the limits of human ingenuity and resilience. But with Elara's presence lingering in the edges of his mind, Kael felt a flicker of hope, a quiet certainty that they were not alone in this fight. The entity was coming, and with it, the possibility of a future they had yet to imagine. Kael's days became consumed by a singular, unrelenting focus, understanding what had become of Elara, her final moments, her cryptic messages, and the visions that now haunted him. They all pointed to something far beyond the entity's destructive power. He spent hours in dimly lit archives, poring over data from their mission, cross-referencing it with obscure scientific theories and ancient texts that hinted at cosmic cycles of renewal. What began as a search for closure soon spiraled into an obsession, one that risked his hard-earned reputation. Colleagues whispered behind his back, their skepticism palpable. "He's chasing ghosts," one muttered. "The entity's a force of nature, not some cosmic philosopher." But Kale ignored the murmurs, his conviction growing with each discovery. The entity wasn't just a harbinger of destruction. It was a catalyst, a mechanism for transformation. The evidence was there, hidden in the patterns of the transmission, the holograms, and even the whispers that had plagued them on that crumbling planet. His breakthrough came late one night, as he pieced together fragments of data that others had dismissed as noise. The entity's energy signature wasn't random. It followed a precise rhythm, a pulse that mirrored the cycles of life and death observed in nature. Stars were born, they burned, and they died, seeding the cosmos with the building blocks of new worlds. The entity, he realized, was part of that cycle, a cosmic reset button, clearing the way for evolution on a scale humanity had never imagined. But the implications were staggering. If the entity wasn't here to destroy but to transform, what did that mean for humanity? Could they survive its passage, not as they were, but as something new? Kale's mind raced with possibilities. Perhaps the entity's energy could alter human biology, accelerating evolution and unlocking untapped potential. Or maybe it would merge human consciousness with its own, creating a hybrid existence that defied the limits of mortality. When he presented his findings to the scientific council, the room erupted in debate. "You're suggesting we embrace annihilation as some kind of cosmic gift," one member scoffed. "This is reckless speculation, not science." Kale stood firm, his voice steady despite the growing tension. "I'm not suggesting we do nothing. I'm saying we need to rethink our approach. Survival isn't just about enduring the storm. It's about learning to navigate it." Elara understood that. She saw the entity not as an enemy, but as a force we could adapt to. And if we're willing to listen, her message might just save us. His words fell on deaf ears for many, but a few saw the merit in his theory. Among them was Dr. Elara Voss, a renowned biologist who had spent her career studying extremophiles organisms that thrived in conditions once thought impossible for life. If the entity is a force of transformation, she argued, then maybe we can find a way to harness its energy, to guide its effects rather than resist them. Together, Kael and Elara began to explore the possibilities, their collaboration sparking a new wave of research. They developed experimental models, testing how organic matter responded to simulated versions of the entity's energy. The results were inconclusive but promising, hinting at a potential for adaptation that no one had dared to consider. Yet, despite the progress, Kale couldn't shake the feeling that he was missing something. The visions of Ellara persisted, her presence growing clearer with each passing day. In one, she stood before him, her form shimmering with the same bluish light that had surrounded the crystalline device. "You're closer than you think," she said, her voice echoing with an otherworldly resonance. "But the key isn't in the data, it's in the connection. The entity isn't just transforming the physical. It's reshaping consciousness itself." Her words lingered in his mind, a puzzle he couldn't quite solve. But as the entity's arrival drew nearer, Kale knew one thing for certain: humanity's survival depended on more than just technology or biology. It required a fundamental shift in how they saw themselves and their place in the cosmos. The storm was coming, and with it, the chance to become something greater, if they were brave enough to embrace it. The day the entity arrived was unlike any other. The sky, once a familiar canvas of blue and white, now shimmered with an eerie, otherworldly glow. Cities stood still, their streets emptied as humanity held its breath, waiting for the inevitable. Kale stood atop a fortified observation tower, his eyes fixed on the horizon. The air crackled with tension, a palpable energy that seemed to hum in sync with the approaching force. He adjusted the microphone before him, his hands steady despite the storm of emotions raging inside. Behind him, screens displayed live feeds from every corner of the globe, faces filled with fear, hope, and everything in between. This was the moment he had been preparing for, the moment Ellara had foreseen. "Today," he began, his voice calm but resonant, "we stand on the brink of something extraordinary. For years, we feared the unknown, clung to what we thought was certain, but the universe doesn't operate on our terms. It's vast, indifferent, and yet infinitely connected. The entity isn't here to destroy us. It's here to remind us of that connection, to challenge us to evolve, to adapt, to become something more." His words echoed across the airwaves, reaching millions who listened in silence. Some found solace in his message, their fear tempered by a flicker of hope. Others clung to their skepticism, their resistance rooted in a desperate need for control. "We've spent lifetimes building walls," Kale continued, his tone softening. "But walls won't save us now. What will save us is our ability to let go, to trust in the process of transformation, even when we can't see the outcome." As he spoke, the entity's presence grew stronger, its light washing over the landscape like a tidal wave. The ground trembled, the air thick with a static charge that made the hairs on the back of his neck stand on end. Yet, amidst the chaos, Kale felt an unexpected calm. In his mind's eye, Ellara appeared, her form bathed in the same bluish light that now enveloped the world. "You're ready," she said, her voice a soothing balm against the mounting tension. This isn't the end, Kale. It's the beginning of something you can't yet imagine. Trust the process. Trust yourself. Her words steadied him, grounding him in the face of the unknown. He stepped forward, leaving the safety of the tower and walking toward the source of the light. Around him, the world seemed to dissolve, the boundaries between reality and possibility blurring into a single, unified whole. The entity's energy enveloped him, its presence both overwhelming and strangely familiar. For a moment, he hesitated, the weight of his doubts threatening to pull him back. But then he thought of Ellara, of her unwavering belief in the power of transformation, in the resilience of the human spirit. She had faced the unknown with courage, and now it was his turn to do the same. As he stepped into the light, a wave of clarity washed over him. The fear, the resistance, the endless questions, they all faded into insignificance. What remained was a profound sense of connection, a realization that he was part of something far greater than himself. The entity wasn't just a force of destruction, it was a bridge to a new way of being, a catalyst for growth on a scale humanity had never dared to imagine. Behind him, the world watched in awe as the light consumed him, its brilliance blinding yet strangely beautiful. For those who had doubted, it was a moment of reckoning. For those who had believed, it was a glimmer of hope. And for Kael, it was the culmination of a journey that had begun with a whisper from the stars, a journey that was far from over. The entity's light continued to spread, its energy transforming everything it touched. Cities, landscapes, even the air itself seemed to shimmer with a new vitality. It wasn't destruction, it was renewal, and as the world embraced this new reality, one thing became clear. The storm had passed, but the transformation had only just begun. The entity's passage over Earth was not the cataclysm many had feared. Instead, it was a metamorphosis, a wave of light and energy that washed over the planet, leaving nothing unchanged. Cities glowed with an ethereal luminescence, forests pulsed with newfound vitality, and even the air seemed charged with a quiet, humming energy. Humanity, too, was transformed. Those who emerged from the light found themselves changed in ways they could scarcely comprehend. Enhanced perception, heightened intuition, and an unshakable sense of connection to the cosmos. These were the gifts left behind by the entity's touch. For Kael, the transformation was deeply personal. As the light enveloped him, he felt a profound shift within himself, as though the barriers between his mind and the universe had dissolved. Memories of Alara flooded his consciousness, her voice clear and resonant. "You've done it," she said, her presence a comforting weight in his mind. "You've shown them the way." And then, as quickly as she had appeared, she was gone, her essence, merging with the entity, her sacrifice ensuring that her message would endure. The world that emerged from the entity's passage was both familiar and alien. Gone were the days of division and fear. In their place was a shared understanding, a collective awareness of humanity's place in the cosmos. People found themselves drawn to one another, their newfound abilities fostering a sense of unity that transcended language, culture, and geography. The scars of the past remained, but they were no longer wounds. They were reminders of the resilience that had carried humanity through its darkest hours. Kale became a symbol of that resilience. His journey, from skeptic to believer, mirrored humanity's own transformation. Where once he had seen the entity as a threat, he now understood it as a catalyst, a force that had pushed humanity to evolve, to shed its limitations and embrace its potential. Elara's legacy lived on through him, her quiet strength and unwavering belief in the power of connection, inspiring a new generation to look to the stars with hope, not fear. And so, when the time came to send a new transmission, it was Kale who stood before the console, his hands steady as he began to type. The message was simple but profound, a declaration of humanity's readiness to embrace the cosmos, not as conquerors, but as explorers. To any who may hear this, he began, his voice steady and filled with quiet resolve. We stand as one, united by the challenges we've faced and the transformations we've undergone. We are ready to meet the universe not as strangers, but as partners in the endless dance of creation and renewal. The transmission soared into the void, a beacon of hope and possibility. As it disappeared into the stars, Kale felt a quiet sense of peace. The storm had passed, but the journey was far from over. The entity had changed them, but it had also shown them the path forward, a path of connection, of growth, of endless discovery. And as the stars shimmered above, humanity took its first steps into a future that was brighter, bolder, and more boundless than anyone could have imagined. The story ended not with a finale, but with a beginning, a promise that the cosmos was no longer a distant, untouchable mystery. It was a partner, a teacher, a home. And for the first time in its history, humanity was ready to embrace it, not with fear, but with open arms and a heart full of wonder. The world after the entity's passage was no longer the same, but it wasn't broken, it was reborn. Cities glowed softly under the light of a transformed sky, their structures now interwoven with the faint, bluish energy the entity had left behind. Forests, once silent, hummed with life, their trees standing taller, their leaves shimmering with an otherworldly iridescence. Even the air seemed alive, carrying whispers of a deeper connection, as though the cosmos itself was now a part of every breath. Humanity, too, had changed. People moved with a newfound awareness, their senses heightened, their minds attuned to a rhythm that felt both ancient and entirely new. At the heart of this transformation was Kael. Once a skeptic, he had become a beacon of hope, his journey from doubt to understanding mirroring humanity's own evolution. He wandered the rebuilt cities, his presence a quiet reminder of what they had endured and what they had gained. Elara's words echoed in his mind, her final message a guiding light in the chaos of change. It's not about surviving, she had said, it's about thriving. About becoming something more, the distant world's ruins, now a silent testament to the civilization that had sent the transmission, remained shrouded in mystery. Expeditions were planned, their purpose not to conquer but to learn. What had they understood that humanity was only now beginning to grasp? What secrets did their ruins hold, and how could they guide the next chapter of humanity's story? These questions lingered, unanswered but not ignored. They were a reminder that the universe was vast, its mysteries endless, and its lessons waiting to be discovered. One evening, under a sky alive with stars, a child sat beside a fire, their wide eyes reflecting the flickering light. An older figure, their face lined with the weight of memories, began to speak. Once, long ago, there was a woman named Elara, They began, their voice soft but steady. She heard a whisper from the stars, a message from a world that no longer exists. And that message changed everything. The child listened, their imagination painting the tale in vivid colors. They saw Ellara standing in the ruins of a distant planet, her heart heavy, but her resolve unshakable. They saw Kale, his sharp mind and guarded heart, stepping into the light to lead humanity through its darkest hour. And they saw the entity, not as a monster, but as a force of transformation, a reminder that even in the face of the unknown, there was always hope. As the story unfolded, the child's gaze drifted upward, toward the stars that twinkled like distant fires. "Do you think it's still out there?" they asked, their voice filled with wonder. The storyteller smiled, their eyes following the child's gaze. "The entity, maybe, or maybe it's everywhere now, a part of everything. The stars, the trees, even you and me." That's what Ellara and Kael taught us, that we're all connected, all part of something bigger than ourselves. The fire crackled softly, its warmth a contrast to the cool night air. The child leaned back, their mind racing with possibilities. The tale of the last transmission wasn't just a story, it was a promise that the universe was full of wonders waiting to be discovered, of challenges waiting to be met, and of connections waiting to be made. And as the storyteller's voice faded into the night, the stars above seemed to shine a little brighter, their light a reminder of the infinite possibilities that lay ahead. The storm had passed, but the journey was far from over. Humanity had been tested, transformed, and united. And now, with the lessons of the past as their guide, they were ready to step into a future as boundless as the cosmos itself. The child closed their eyes, the story settling in their heart like a seed ready to grow. Somewhere, in the vast expanse of the universe, the entity's light still shimmered, a silent, eternal reminder that even in the face of the unknown, there was always a way forward. And as the night deepened, the world slept, dreaming of the stars and the stories they had yet to tell.